light on, brother. That's right, you heard me. Nothing is what it seems, and I'm going to reveal that in this video. The truth about the Yukon isn't the cold, or the silence, or the way the winter sun never quite manages to claw its way above the horizon. The truth is that once you're deep enough into the white, the landscape starts to feel less like geography and more like the inside of a massive frozen ribcage. And sometimes you hear things scraping against the bone. They found Henderson's rig 40 miles north of Eagle Plains. His truck was locked, airtight, doors sealed from the inside. The engine was still idling, exhaust plume fading weakly into the 50 below air. But the cab itself felt wrong. It wasn't the blood, there wasn't any, or the signs of a struggle. It was the temperature. When the Mounties finally managed to shatter the frozen lock, the burst of air that hit them felt like a physical blow. It was impossibly cold, far colder than the air outside. One of those men said it felt like touching a frozen star, a place where heat had never existed. And inside, dusting the seat, the dash, and the floor, was a fine gray crystalline powder. Bone dust, they said later, though Henderson's clothes were still folded neatly on the bunk, untouched. They called it a highly unusual disappearance. We, the men who run the ice roads, called it the first warning. I was 3 weeks into a heavy load run, hauling structural steel that moaned and shrieked with every drop in temperature. My route took me through the desolate stretch of the Dempster, where the tree line thins out and you are truly alone with the tundra. Loneliness is usually a comfort out here. It means the only unpredictable thing is the weather. But since Henderson, the isolation had curdled into a suffocating presence. The air was so cold, it didn't just hurt to breathe. It felt like inhaling fractured glass, coating the lining of your lungs with a brittle frost.
Even the heavy diesel engine of the Kenworth seemed to struggle, its persistent, rhythmic roar serving less as transportation and more as a desperate heartbeat fighting the crushing silence of the landscape. Everything was white and blue, the snow reflecting the weak, fractured moonlight and the perpetual twilight sky. The shadows were absolute black, deep pools that seemed to swallow the light whole. And every few miles, as I passed a particularly dense cluster of frozen spruce, I felt a familiar shiver, the kind that whispers, "You are being watched." That night, the cold had a metallic tang to it, a smell like burnt copper and ozone, which always precedes the worst of the electrical storms. But the sky was clear, save for the sickly yellow glow of my high beams slicing through the crystalline air. I'd been running for 18 hours, fueled primarily by stale coffee and the low-grade paranoia that keeps us alive. The first sign that reality had begun to fray wasn't visual.
It was tactile. I was cresting a long, subtle incline, my tires gripping the packed ice, when the truck, a 20-ton beast, momentarily dipped, not into a pothole, but as if the ground beneath the tires had momentarily softened, or as if an impossible, sudden weight had slammed down onto the trailer. The cab lurched. The steel cables connecting the trailer groaned a complaint that was too high-pitched for metal, and the engine strained. I checked the dash, everything nominal. I glanced in my side mirror, the glass vibrating slightly with the engine's rhythm. Nothing but the endless white trail behind me. But the feeling persisted, a sort of parasitic drag, like I was suddenly hauling 10 extra tons of dead weight that wasn't registered on the suspension. I tapped the brakes, slowing the rig, trying to feel out the problem. And that's when I saw it. It was a flicker, impossible and fleeting, in the black space where the trailer met the darkness of the surrounding pines. A shape.
Not a deer, not a wolf. Those move with the hesitation of flesh and bone. This shape was long and low, moving parallel to the truck,
and it was moving impossibly fast, keeping pace with my 50 miles per hour, almost too close to the shoulder. It was dark, a patch of absolute shadow, darker than the midnight blue of the sky. My breath hitched, creating a visible fog cloud inside the cab. I strained my eyes, trying to catch the refraction of my rear running lights against whatever it was. Nothing. Whatever it was, it absorbed light entirely. It was just a continuous, low silhouette, skimming the snow line. Then, just as quickly as I perceived the extra weight, it vanished. The truck instantly felt lighter, almost buoyant, and the engine noise deepened, settling back into its accustomed heavy rumble. I tried to rationalize it. Snowdrift, exhaust distortion, highway hypnosis playing tricks in the dead zone between caffeine spikes.
But the metallico, ozony smell in the cab suddenly intensified, stinging my nostrils, and the hairs on my arm stood up in response to a subtle electrical charge that felt like static, only deeper, radiating from the steering wheel. I didn't stop. You don't stop on the Dempster unless you have a mechanical failure that mandates it. To stop is to invite the cold to claim you, piece by frozen piece. But I pushed the engine harder, pushing past the safety limits, wanting only to reach the next check station. The isolation became heavier, denser. I realized suddenly that I hadn't seen a single animal track in hours, hadn't heard the snap of a branch, hadn't even seen a single raven, the scavenging birds that are usually the only constant companions out here. The wilderness was holding its breath. I reached the emergency layover point near the abandoned Scarran mine at all 3 a.m. It was supposed to be a safe, well-stocked depot, little more than a corrugated iron shack with a satellite uplink.
I pulled my rig beside the small building, the brakes sighing with exhaustion. The moment my engine quieted, the silence hit me like a physical blanket. It was immediate and absolute, a painful, ringing absence of sound that seemed to press inward on the fragile metal of the cab. I checked the shack. The exterior lights were smashed, jagged shards of glass frozen into the ice. The heavy, insulated steel door was ajar, hanging crookedly on one hinge. A gust of wind, or something else, had clearly been here. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, my breathing labored and shallow. The metallic smell was overwhelming here. I pushed the door open, the hinge screaming in protest. Inside, the emergency satellite phone, our one link to the outside world in this dead zone, was scattered across the floor in pieces, not broken by impact, but peeled apart, the tiny wiring splayed out like pulled nerves.
The emergency beacon was similarly dismantled, its circuit board exposed and scorched black around the edges. But it was the floor that made my stomach seize up and twist. The shack was built on a thick concrete slab, but running across the floor, stopping abruptly at the broken back wall, was a series of shallow indentations. They were long, maybe 3 feet across, perfectly parallel, and they looked less like tracks and more like grooves pressed by immense, continuous weight. And in the center of the concrete, covering the tracks and radiating outwards, was a thin layer of crystalline frost. It was defying the temperature of the shack, which was merely freezing. This frost felt subterranean, eternal, and pressed into the frost, almost invisible, were the crystalline gray grains, the bone dust, Henderson's dust. I backed out slowly, the fear crawling up my throat like dry ivy, scraping my vocal cords until I couldn't breathe. It hadn't just followed Henderson.
It had waited for him here. It had anticipated his stop. I slammed the truck door shut, locked it, and threw the engine back to life. I didn't bother checking the trailer or my load. I needed to move. I needed noise. I needed to escape the suffocating knowledge that whatever this was, it wasn't random. And it certainly wasn't acting like an animal seeking warmth or food. It was performing an action, an elimination. I roared away from the shack, driving fast, reckless of the ice beneath me. I drove for 2 hours, watching the mirrors, searching the periphery, but the dark shape never reappeared. The metallic, burnt smell began to dissipate, replaced only by the comforting stink of diesel. I began to convince myself I was safe. Maybe the entity was tied to that location. Maybe it had finished whatever dark work it had begun at Scar and Mine.
I was crossing the highest ridge of the run, a place where the wind rips the snow clean off the black asphalt, leaving a sleek, dangerous sheet of ice. I decided I couldn't risk the load anymore. I needed to stop, check the security chains and the trailer seals. If I lost the steel, I lost my contract. And frankly, the exhaustion was making me hallucinate. I pulled the air brake, the rig hissing to a stop. I grabbed my tools and flashlight, pulling my massive parka tight against the brutal wind. Stepping out of the cab was like diving into liquid nitrogen. The air burned my skin immediately. I walked the length of the trailer, the massive tires crunching the brittle ice beneath my boots. I checked the steel cable tension. Perfect. I checked the latches. Secure. Everything was fine. The tension in my shoulders eased infinitesimally. I reached the rear of the trailer, shining my light across the corrugated metal doors.
I was about to turn around when I caught sight of a disturbance on the trailer surface. Near the bottom, just above the rear axle, was a faint discoloration. It was about the size of a man's chest, a dull, dark smear against the silver metal. I knelt, wiping my heavy glove across the patch, expecting road dirt. The metal beneath my glove wasn't cold. It was faintly, sickeningly warm. And when I pulled my hand back, the flashlight beam caught the reflection of what looked like a perfect, polished oil slick. But the viscous, dark substance was already beginning to freeze, forming intricate, branching patterns of absolute black ice. It smelled strongly of ozone and burnt copper. I stood up, my gaze racing the length of the trailer and then upwards, over the roof of the cab, towards the unending white void of the highway ahead. And that's when the horrifying realization struck me, silencing the frantic chatter of my own fear. It hadn't been following me.
The extra weight, the sudden lurch, the scorched scent at the mine shack, the feeling of something parasitic clinging to my rig. It hadn't been tailing me from behind, patiently waiting for me to falter. It had been riding the roof of the trailer the entire time. It had been clinging to the steel, waiting for me to stop and exit the only place of frail warmth and safety. I shone the flashlight over the top of my trailer. The beam caught nothing but wind-blown snow and a heavy black tarpaulin. But the light revealed a faint impression, a place where the snow was disturbed, the shape of a massive long silhouette that had pressed the loose snow flat, now fluttering slightly in the wind. And directly above the cab, where the heavy metal visor shields the driver from the low sun, there was a faint, shallow scratch, long, parallel metallic grooves running down the frozen paint. They were precisely 3 feet apart, just like the indentations in the concrete shack. I was exposed.
Completely alone, 50 below zero, with the nearest human contact 300 miles behind me, and something that defied all laws of physics and biology was right there. I turned quickly, desperately scrambling for the cab door. My boots slipped on the ice. I heard a sound then, closer than the wind, softer than the scrape of my tools hitting the ice. It was a wet, clicking sound, like frozen mandibles closing.
I twisted my neck, fear overriding all pain, and my flashlight beam snagged on the very edge of the tree line, not 20 yards away. And there it was, not the vague shadow of the mirror, but a thing of geometric horror. It was immense, low to the ground, and impossibly long, 10, maybe 15 feet. It didn't have eyes or fur or limbs that made sense. It was a shimmering black plane, a sleek void that seemed to bend the light around its edges, making the stars behind it warp and flicker.
It had a movement that was more like flowing liquid than walking, and its surface, wherever the light touched it, had the texture of finely ground glass and polished obsidian. The clicking sound intensified, and I realized it wasn't coming from its mouth, but from the grinding of its endless, segmented body against the frozen ground. Then, from the center of that black mass, two things extended towards me. They were not claws or arms, but crystalline protrusions, perfectly formed rods of ice-black matter that seemed to be testing the air, sensing the heat that poured off my exhausted body. They were 3 feet apart. I saw the gray dusting clinging to those crystalline rods, and I screamed, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed instantly by the vast, silent cold. I threw myself against the truck door, fumbling the frozen latch, my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough to crack them. I finally yanked the door open, here lay myself inside, slamming the door and locking it frantically. I leaned back against the seat, hyperventilating, the smell of burnt copper, ozone now thick and cloying inside the cab. I looked out the massive windshield, my eyes wide and wild. The creature had stopped flowing. It was utterly motionless now, a perfect black horizontal line 20 feet from my rig, waiting. The two crystalline rods were aimed directly at my head, silent and patient. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, my muscles locked in a desperate effort not to move, not to breathe too loudly. I knew, with the chilling certainty of absolute terror, that it hadn't left the scene of Henderson's disappearance. It had just changed vehicles, and now it was ready to harvest. The Yukon is vast, but tonight, the inside of my cab felt smaller than a coffin.
And I could feel the cold, that unnatural, freezing cold, beginning to seep through the sealed metal, searching for the heat of my bone. If you are listening to this, and the silence has begun to press too hard against your ears, and your truck feels suddenly heavy on the inclines, remember this. Check your mirrors, but look closer at your roof. And if you smell the copper and ozone, do not stop. Do not stop until the light comes back, and hope that the light is enough to burn off the shadows before they claim you entirely. The engine is running, the diesel is screaming, and the shadows are waiting. Will you be there when I try to outrun the thing that rides the ice roads, or will you stay in the dark? Subscribe and lock in your doors. The road ahead is longer than you think. The radio hiss had become the sound of my own panic, trying to find an escape. It wasn't the freezing that killed him, I realized, looking at the faded picture of the last driver who tried this route.
It was the absolute silence of the cab after the screeching stopped, and the smell of wet metal and something that wasn't blood, but ozone and rust. I knew, without needing to verify it, that this was the end of the road. The cab smelled stale now, of old coffee and fresh, paralyzing dread. Outside, the Yukon air was no longer just cold. It was a weapon, sharp, odorless, and so cold it felt brittle, capable of shattering bone just by touch. We were moving through a narrow black ribbon cut through endless, blinding white. The only sound was the low, grinding drone of the engine, the sole indicator that life still existed in this glacial abyss, the sole rhythm keeping my heart from seizing up. The silence outside was suffocating, the kind of silence that doesn't just lack sound, but actively devours it. It happened just past the phantom turnoff for Dawson Creek, a place that exists mostly as a name on a sign, half buried in permafrost.
I saw flesh, nor reflected light, but absorbed light. A density of shadow that moved faster than light itself. It wasn't a flicker, it was a sudden, sickening thunk that resonated through the chassis and rattled my teeth, vibrating up through the steering wheel and into my palms. The load stabilizer light on the dash, which had been steady green for hours, began flickering rapidly, frantically, like a trapped insect. Something massive, something foreign was on the rig. I slammed the brakes, the ABS screaming futilely on the packed ice, the massive 18-wheeler hydroplaning slightly, pulling sharply to the right. I braced, expecting a collision with a moose or a fallen tree. Nothing. I looked in the mirrors. Nothing but churning snow dust and the red warning flash of my taillights. But when the truck finally steadied, I looked down, out the passenger side window. They started abruptly.
3 impossibly deep gouges pressed into the pristine ice beside my tires, running parallel to the truck, perfectly equidistant. They weren't footprints. They were too large, too geometric, and they ended as suddenly as they began, as if the thing had lifted off at 60 miles per hour. I felt a wave of cold that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. It was an invasive, psychic cold that penetrated the diesel heater, the thick window glass, and the wool of my jacket. I felt watched. The feeling wasn't external either. It felt internal, sitting in the passenger seat, breathing my oxygen, sharing the stale air. I knew I couldn't stop. Stopping meant becoming static, and static things here become meals or monuments. I threw the truck back into gear and floored it, the Cummins engine protesting the abuse. Hours passed in a maniac white-knuckle blur. I drove until the fuel gauge screamed yellow, driving on instinct and pure, uncut adrenaline, my eyes burning.
Then, that discovery. I smear on the driver's side window. It was high up, near the top corner. Far too high for any natural Yukon predator to reach, even a massive Kodiak bear. It wasn't dirt. It was clear, sticky, and shimmered faintly green under the dash lights, like wet mica or dried alien sap. My stomach dropped out of me. I realized with a paralyzing certainty, whatever it wasn't following me from behind. It was traveling with me. It had been riding the rig, maybe the roof, maybe the very structure of the truck, the entire time. I needed context. I fumbled for the company logbook beneath the seat, hoping to find an explanation for the strange disappearances, a safety protocol I had missed. Instead, my fingers brushed against old, waterlogged, leather-bound books hidden behind the fuse box cover. Not the standard route logs. They were handwritten, brittle with age, dating back to the 1950s. The entries weren't routes or fuel stops. They were frantic, spidery sketches.
Stick figures being dragged away from rudimentary campfires. Descriptions of soundless movement in the peripheral darkness. And a recurring, horrifying symbol. 3 intersecting lines, always drawn near the word Watcher. I understood. This wasn't a recent phenomenon linked to the new routes. This road, this specific corridor of ice and shadow, was bait. It had been waiting here for decades, catching things that moved, things that produced heat and light. I tried radioing dispatch. Total white noise, the sound of the universe refusing to participate.
I desperately tried the emergency channel. Still nothing but the loud, painful static. Then, through the static, a low, wet click came through the speaker. Not noise, it was a sound, like bone grinding against wet granite, followed by a faint mechanical sigh, close, intimate. It wasn't trying to communicate. It was testing the microphone, measuring the distance, using the truck's equipment against me.
Eu yanked the cable out to the radio port, my hands shaking so violently I nearly tore the wire. It knew I was trying to break the pattern. I was alone, running blind toward the destination I no longer believed existed, with a rider I couldn't see but could certainly feel. The air pressure started to change in the cab. My ears popped painfully, like descending rapidly in an airplane, but we weren't changing altitude. The temperature plummeted. The condensation on the windshield began to crystallize instantly, frosting over from the inside. And then it appeared in the high beams. It didn't step out from the woods. It manifested. One moment, the road was empty, illuminated by my focused light. The next, there was a density of absolute blackness hovering in the air directly ahead of the truck. It absorbed the light, not just reflecting it back. It consumed the photons, leaving a negative space framed only by the faint, shimmering green of the northern aurora behind it.
It dropped. It landed on the hood. The metal buckled instantly beneath its weight, the heavy-duty engine structure groaning a high-pitched metallic complaint as the radiator ruptured with a sharp hiss of steam and antifreeze. The truck shuddered violently. The thing was impossibly heavy, a density that defied mass calculations. The windshield shattered inward, not from direct impact, but from the sheer, crushing pressure of its arrival. I felt the frigid, alien air rush into the small space of the cab, overwhelming the meager warmth. The smell, ozone, rot, and the sharp, coppery scent of burnt wire was suffocating.
And finally saw the structure of his limbs. Too many of them, impossibly long, jointed only twice, ending in hard, needle-like points. Not claws, but tools. They probed the shattered glass in the dash. In the face, there was no face, just a smooth, polished surface that somehow reflected the dashboard's emergency brake light in 3 tiny, distinct, burning red points, ranged in the same triangular configuration found in the 1950s logbook. Adrenaline, pure survival instinct, took over the wheel. I grabbed the only weapon I had left, the heavy-duty tire iron stored behind the seat. I didn't think. I swung wildly, a desperate animalistic strike aimed at the center mass of the horrifying density on my hood. I hit something yielding, yet unnervingly hard, like striking cured leather stretched taut over poured concrete. A high-pitched, rattling shriek filled the cab. It wasn't a sound of pain, but a sound of mechanical irritation, a scraping of dry metal that made my eardrums ache. It recoiled slightly, its structure blurring. Then, one of the pointed limbs plunged through the hole in the windshield and hooked around the steering wheel, turning it sharply to the left, trying to steer us off the narrow, icy track and into the 200-foot drop of the valley gorge. Desperation fueled me. I threw the truck into neutral, slammed my door open, and leaped out, rolling violently onto the packed, blinding snow, praying the fall didn't break my neck. I scrambled away, deafened by the engine's dying screams and the alien rattle of the thing's irritation. I risked a look back. The massive truck, my only link to sanity and civilization, was now a laboratory. The entity was not destroying the truck randomly. It was systematically dismantling it, piece by piece, with chilling precision. It pulled the door off its hinges, discarded it, and began working its way into the engine block, its thin limbs scraping and digging.
It wasn't eating the metal, it was studying it, peeling back layers of paint and wiring, extracting something I couldn't see, discarding the rest into the snow. It had claimed the road. It owned this space. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs failed, collapsing into a drift, the sound of grinding metal slowly fading behind the howling wind. They found me hours later, a snowplow crew on an emergency run, nearly frozen solid, babbling incoherently about geometric shadows and the sound of dry bone. They said I was delirious, suffering from exposure and hypoxia. They airlifted me out. But when I finally thawed out in the hospital, my jacket, the thick, insulated parka that should have protected me, was lying on the chair. I picked it up. On the back, right over the spine, where the thing would have touched me if it had reached fully through the broken window, there were 3 deep, perfectly circular holes.
They were melted through every layer of synthetic padding and nylon, precise, clean holes the size of a thumb, and they smelled faintly of ozone. I hadn't felt the touch, but it had marked me. The cold still clings to me, not the temperature, but the absence of warmth in the universe. And sometimes, when the streetlights flicker on the edge of my periphery, I see movement that doesn't belong. A sudden geometric shadow that lasts for a microsecond too long. They say the roads are open again, but the new drivers rarely make it to the end without reporting strange sounds. If these desolate highways call to you, if the silence of the far north beckons, perhaps you should heed the warning of the drivers who never came back. Or perhaps you enjoy staying awake, waiting for the sound of silence. Subscribe for more tales from the fringe, stories meant to keep you questioning the edge of the map, and perhaps praying for the dawn.